Hello, and welcome back, my lovely Lovecraftians, to a very special upload dedicated in the honor of Mesotrashed, a Cuthluwu devotee on Ko-fi. They requested the Tales of Satampra Zeiros by Clark Ashton Smith. Personally, I've heard of Clark Ashton Smith, and I know they write Eldritch horror, but I've never read any of their work, so we should be in for a bit of a treat here. I, Satampra Zeiros, of Ulzadorm, shall write with my left hand, since I no longer have any other, the tale of everything that befalls Trevo Ophius and myself in the shrine of the god Tosugua, which lies neglected by the worship of man in the jungle taken Suberus of common Rium. That long deserted capital of the Hyborian rulers, I shall write it with the violet juices of the Savan palm, which turn to a blood-red rubric, with the passage of years on a strong vellum that is made from the skin of the Macedon, as a warning to all good thieves and adventurers who may hear some lying legend of the lost treasure of Comorium and be tempted thereby. Now, trivial Ophius was my lifelong friend, and my trustworthy companion, and all such enterprises as required deft fingers and a habit of mind both agile and adroit. I can say without flattering myself or trivial Ophius either that we carried to an incomparable success more than one undertaking from which fellow craftsmen of a much wider renown than ourselves might well have recoiled in dismay. To be more explicit, I refer to the theft of the jewels of Queen Cunabria, which were kept in a room with 20 venomous reptiles wandered at will, and the breaking of the endowment boxes of Akramai, in which were all the medallions of an early dynasty of Hyborian kings. It is true that these medallions were difficult and perilous to dispose of, and that we sold them at a dire sacrifice to the captain of a barbarian vessel from remote Lemuria, but nevertheless, the breaking of that box was a glorious feat, for it had been done in an absolute silence, on account of the proximity of a dozen guards, who were all armed with tridents. We made use of a rare and mordant acid, but I must no longer linger too long and too gorgeously by the way, however great the temptation to ramble on amid heroic memories in the high glamour of valiant or slightful deeds. In our occupation, as in all others, the vicissitudes of fortune are not oftentimes to be reckoned with, and the goddess Chance is not always prodigal in her favors. So it was Tiberius Ulpius and I, at the time which I write, had found ourselves in a condition of pecuniary depletion, which, though temporary, was nevertheless extreme, and was quite inconvenient and annoying, coming as it did on the heels of a more prosperous days and more profitable midnights. People had become accursedly chary of their jewels and other valuables. Windows and doors were double barred, new and perplexing locks were in use, guards have grown more vigilant or less solemn. In short, all the natural difficulties of our profession had multiplied themselves. But alas, at one time we were reduced to the stealing of more bulky and less precious merchandising than that in which we customarily dealt, and even this had its dangers. Even now it humiliates me to remember the night where we were nearly caught with a sack of red yams. And I mention all this that I may not seem in any way vainglorious. One evening, in an alley of more humble quarter of Ulzdorum, we stopped to count our available resources and found that we had between us exactly 3 pazors, enough to buy a large bottle of pomegranate wine or 2 loaves of bread. We debated the problem of expenditure. The bread, contemplated Tulvius Omplus, will nurture our bodies, will lend a new and more expeditious force to our spent limbs and our toil-worn fingers. The pomegranate wine, said I, will ennoble our thoughts, will inspire and illuminate our minds, and perchance will reveal to us a mode of escape from our present difficulties. Terrible Ulfius yielded without undue agreement to my superior reasoning, and we sought the doors of the adjacent tavern. The wine was not of the best in regards to flavor, but the quantity and strength were all that could be desired. We sat in the crowded tavern and sipped it at leisure, till all the fire of the bright red liquor had transferred itself to our brains. The darkness and sobriety of our future ways became illuminated as by the light of rosy crescents, and the harsh aspect of the world was marvelously softened. Anon, there came to me an inspiration. Charvius Ulfius, I said, is there any reason why you and I, who are brave men, and now wise subject to the fears and superstitions of the multitude, should not avail ourselves of the kingly treasures of Comorium, a day's journey from this tiresome town, a pleasant sojourn in the country, an afternoon or forenoon of archaeological research, and who knows what we should find? You speak wisely and valiantly, my dear friend, rejoined Tevion Ulfius. Indeed, there is no reason why we should not replenish our deflated finances at the expense of a few dead kings or gods. Now, Gomorium, as all the world knows, was deserted many hundred years ago because of the prophecy of the White Sibyl of Pelarion, who foretold an undescribed and abdominal doom for all mortal beings who should dare try to tarry with its envisaries. Some say that this doom was a pestilence that would have come from the northern waste by the pass of the jungle tribes. Others say that it was from a form of madness. At any rate, no one, neither king nor priest, nor merchant, nor laborer, nor thief, remained in Conormium to abide its arrival, but all departed as single migration to found at the distance of a day's journey the new capital, Osladorium. And strange tales are told of horrors and terrors not to be faced or overcome by man, that haunt forevermore the shrines and mausoleums and places of Comorium, and still it stands, a lustre of marble, a magnificent of granite, all aglow with spires and cupolas and obelisks that the mighty trees of the jungle have not yet overtowed. In a fertile inland valley of Hyperborea, the men say there is its unbroken vaults. There lies entire and unspoiled, as of your rich treasures of olden monarchs, that the high-built tombs retain the gems and electrum that were buried with their mummies, that the fanes have still their golden altar vessels and furnishing, the idols, their precious stones at ear and mouth and nostril and navel. I think that we should have set out that very night, if we only had the encouragement and inspiration of a second bottle of sweet pomegranate wine. As it was, we decided to start at early dawn. The fact that we had no funds for our journey was of a small moment, for unless our former dexterity had altogether failed us, we could levy a modicum of the involuntary tribute from the guiltless folk of the countryside. In the meanwhile, we repaired to our lodgings, where the landlord met us with a grudging welcome and a most ungracious demand for money. But the golden promise of the morrow had armed us against all trivial annoyances, and we waved the fellow aside with a disdain that appeared to astonish, if not subdue him. We slept late. The sun had ascended far upon the azure acclivity of the heavens when we left the gates of Osladorium and took the northern road that leads towards Comorium. We breakfasted well on some amber melons and a stolen fowl that we cooked in the woods, and then resumed our wayfaring, in spite of a fatigue that increased upon us towards the end of the day. Our trip was a pleasurable one, and we found much to divert us in the varied landscapes through which we passed, and their people, some of these people, I am sure, must still remember us with regret, for we did not deny ourselves anything procurable that tempted our fancies or our appetites. It was an agreeable country, full of farms and orchards and running water and greens, flowery woods. At last, some while in the course of the afternoon, we came to an ancient road, long disused and well nigh overgrown, which runs from the highway through the elder jungle to Comorium. No one saw us enter this road, and thus far we met no one. At a single step we passed from all human ken, and it seemed that the silence of the forest around us had lain unstricken by mortal footfall ever since the departure of the legendary king and his people so many centuries before. The trees were vaster than any we had ever seen. They were interwoven by the endless labyrinth volumes, the internal web-like convulsions of creepers almost as old as they themselves. The flowers were unwholesomely large. Their petals bore a leather pallor of a singularly scarlet, and their perfumes were overpoweringly sweet or fested. The fruits along our way were of great size, with purple and orange russet colors, but somehow we did not dare to eat them. The woods grew thicker and more rampant as we went on, and the road, though paved with granite slabs, was more and more overgrown. The trees had ridden themselves in the interstices, often forcing the wide blocks apart, though the sun had not yet neared the horizon. The shades that were cast up from gigantic boles and branches became even denser, and we moved in a dark green twilight fraught with oppressive odors, lush growth, and a vegetable corruption. There were no birds, no animals, such as one would think to find in any wholesome forest, but at rare intervals a stealthy viper, with pale and heavy coils, glided away from our feet among the rank leaves of the roadside, or some enormous moth with powerful and evil-colored mottlings flew before us and disappeared in the immense dimness of the jungle. Abroad already in the half-light, huge purpurate bats with eyes like tiny rubies arose to our approach from the poisonous-looking fruits on which they feasted, and watched us with malignant attention as they hovered noiselessly in the air above, and we felt somehow that we were being watched by others. An invisible presence and a soft of awe fell upon us, and a vague fear of the monstrous jungle, and we no longer spoke aloud or frequently, but only in rare whispers. Among other things, we had contrived to procure along our way a large leathered bottle full of palm spirit. A few sips of the ardent liquor had already served to lighten more than once of the tedium of our journey, and now it was to stand us in good stead. Each of us drank a little draught, and presently the jungle became less awesome, and we wondered why we had allowed the silence and the gloom, the watchful bats, and the broadening immensity to weigh upon our spirits even for a brief while, and I think after a second draught we began to sing. When twilight came, and a waxing moon shone high in the heavens after the hidden thasters had gone down, we were so imbued with the fever of adventure that we decided to push on and reach Comorium that very night. We supped on food that we had levied from the country people, and leathern bottles passed between us several times, then considerably forfeited and repleted with hardihood and the valor of a lofty enterprise, we resumed our journeying. Indeed, we had not much farther to go, even as we were debating between ourselves, with an ardor that makes us oblivious of our long wayfaring, what costly loot would we first choose from among all the mythical treasures of the Comorium. We saw in the moonlight the gleam of marble cupolas and the treetops, and then between the borals and the bowls and the wan pillars of shadowy portcullis, a few more steps, and we tread upon paven streets that ran transversely from the high road we were following into the tall, luxuriant woods on either side. when the fronds of the mighty palm fells overtopped the roofs of ancient houses. We paused, and again the silence of the elder desolation claimed our lips, for the houses were white and still as sepulchres, and the deep shadows that lay around and upon them were chill and sinister, and mysterious as the very shadow of death itself. It seemed that the sun could not have shone for ages in this place, that nothing warmer than the spectral beams of the cadaver's moon had touched the marbles and granites ever since the universal migration prompted by the prophecy of the white Sibyl of Polarian. "I wish it were daylight," murmured Tarvius Opulus. His low tones were oddly sibilant, were unnaturally audible in the dead stillness. "Tarvius Opulus," I replied, "I trust that you are not growing superstitious. I should be loth to think that you are succumbing to the infanities, fancies of the multitude. Howbeit, let us have another drink." We lightened the leathern bottles appreciably by the demand we now made upon its content, and we were marvelously cheered thereby, so much so indeed, that we forthwith started to explore a left-handed avenue which, though it had been laid out with a mathematical directness, vanished at no great distance among the fronded trees. Here, somewhat apart from the other buildings, in a sort of square that the jungle had not yet wholly usurped, we found a small temple of antique architecture, which gave the impression of being far older even than the adjoining edifices. It also differed from these in material, for it was built of a dark bastalic stone, heavily encrusted with lichens that seemed of a coeval antiquity. It was square in form, and had no domes, nor spires, nor facades of pillars, and only a few narrow windows high above the ground. Such temples are rare in Hyperborea nowadays, but we knew it for a shrine of Cuthluwu, one of the elder gods, who received no longer any worship from men, but before whose ashen altars people say the furtive and ferocious beasts of the jungle, the ape, the giant sloth, and the long-toothed tiger, had sometimes been seen to make a scene, and had heard to howl or whine with their inarticulate prayers. The temple, like the other buildings, was in a state of well-nigh perfectly preservation. The only signs of decay were in the carvings lintled on the door, which had crumbled and splintered away in several places. The door itself, wrought of a swarthy bronze, all overgreen by time, stood silently ajar, knowing that there should be a jeweled idol within, not to mention the various altarpieces of valuable metals. We felt the urge of temptation. Certainly, that strength might be required to force open the verdi-covered door. We drank deeply, and then applied ourselves to the task. Of course, the hinges were rusted, and only by dint of mighty and muscular heavings did the door at last begin to move. As we renewed our efforts, it swung slowly inward, with a hideous grating and grinding that mounted to an almost vocal screech, in which we seemed to hear the tones of some unhuman entity. The black interior of the temple yawned before us, and from it there surged an odor of long imprisoned mustiness, combined with a queer and unfamiliar fetidity. To this, however, we gave little heed in the natural excitement of the moment. With my usual foresight, I had provided myself with a piece of resinous wood earlier in that day, thinking that it might serve as a torch in case of any nocturnal explorations of Camorium. I lit this torch, and we entered the shrine. The place was paved with immensely quinquegular flags of the same material from which its walls were built. It was quite bare, except for the image of the gods enthroned at the further ends, the two-tiered altar of obscenely figured metals before the image, and a large and curious-looking basin of bronze supported on 3 legs, which occupied the middle of the floor. Giving the basin hardly a glance, we ran forward, and I thrust my torch into the face of the idol. I had never seen an image of Cuthluwu before, but I recognized him, without difficulty, from the description I had heard. He was very squat and pot-bellied, his head more like that of a monstrous toad deity. and his whole body was covered with an imitation of short fur, somehow giving a vague suggestion of both the bat and the sloth. His sleepy lids were half lowered over his globular eyes, and the tip of a queer tongue issued from his fat mouth. In truth, he was not a comely or a personal sort of god, and I did not wonder at the cessation of his worship, which could only have appealed to a very brutal and aboriginal men at any time. To reveal Ulpius and I began to swear simultaneously by the names of more urban and civilized deities that we saw that not even the commonest of semi-precious gems were visible anywhere, either upon or within any feature or member of this execrable image. With beyond parallel, even the eyes have been carven from the same dull stone as the rest of the abdominal vein. The mouth, nose, ears, and all other orifices were unadorned. We could only wonder at the vice of poverty of the beings who had wrought this unique bestiality. Now that our minds were no longer enthralled by the hopes of immediate riches, we became more keenly aware of our surroundings in general, and in particular we noticed the unfamiliar fetor I had spoken of previously, which had now increasingly uncomfortably in strength. We found that it came from the broad basin, which we proceeded to examine, though without any idea that the examination would be profitable or even pleasant. The basin, I have said, was very large indeed, and it was no less than 6 feet in diameter by 3 in depth, and its brim was the height of a tall man's shoulder from the floor. The 3 legs that bore it were curved and massive in termination, and feline paws displaying their talons. When we approached and peered into the brim, we saw the bill was filled with a sort of viscous and semi-licensed substance, quite opaque in a sooty color. It was from this odor came, an odor which, though unsearably foul, was nevertheless not an odor of putrefaction, but resembled rather the smell of some vile and unclean creature of the marshes. The odor was almost beyond endurance, and we were about to turn away when we perceived a slight emulsion on the surface, as if the sooty liquid was being agitated from within by a submerged animal or other entity. This embelliation increased rapidly, and the center swelled as if with the action of some powerful yeast, and we watched in utter horror, while an uncouth and amorphous head with dull and bulging eyes arose gradually on an ever-lengthening neck and stared us in the face with primordial malignity. Then 2 arms, if one could call them arms, likewise arose inch by inch, and we saw that that thing was not, as we thought, a creature immersed in a liquid, but that the liquid itself had been put forth this hideous neck and head, and was now forming these damnable arms. Those groped towards us tentacle-like appendages in lie of claw or hand. A fear which we had never experienced, or even in dreams, or which we had found no hint in our most perilous nocturnal excursions, deprived us of the faculty of speech, but not of movement. We recoiled a few paces from the bowl, and coincidently with our steps, the horrible neck and arms continued to lengthen. Then the whole mass of the dark fluid began to rise, and far more quickly than the savannah juice runs from my pen, it poured over the rims of the basin like a torrent of black quicksilver, taking in as it reached the floor of an utterly Orpheus form, which immediately developed more than a dozen short legs. What unimaginable horror of plastic life which loathly spawn of the primordial slime had come forth to confront us. We did not pause to consider our conjuncture. The monstrosity was too awful to permit or even a brief contemplation. Also, its intentions were too plainly hostile, and it gave evidence of anthropologic inclinations, for it slithered towards us with an unbelievable speed, uncoiled, and celerity of motion, opening its toothless mouth of amazing capacity as it gaped upon us, revealing a tongue that was long and serpent-like. Its jaws widened with the same extreme elasticity that accompanied all of its other movements. We saw that our departure from the vein of Cuthluwu had become most imperative, and turning our backs to all the abominations of that unhallowed shrine, we crossed the sill with a single leap and ran headlong in the moonlight through the suburbs of Comorium. We rounded every convenient corner. We doubled upon our tracks behind the places of time-forgotten nobles and the warehouses of unrecorded merchants. We chose preferably the place where the intrusive jungle trees were highest and thickest, and at last, on a by-road, where the outlying houses were no longer visible, we paused and dared to look back. Our lungs were intolerably strained, were ready to burst with their heroic efforts, and the various fatigues of the day had told upon us all too grievously. But when we saw at our heels the black monster following us with a serpentine and adulting ease, like a torrent that descends a long declivity, our flagging limbs were miraculously reanimated, and we plunged from the betraying light of the by-road into the pathless jungle, hoping to evade our pursuer. In the labyrinth of boles and vines and gigantic leaves, we stumbled over roots and fallen trees. We tore our raiment and lacerated our skin on the savage brambles. We collided in the gloom with our huge trunks and limber saplings that bent before us. We heard the hissing above tree snakes that spat their venom at us from the burrows above, and the grunting and the howling of unseen animals when we trod upon them in our precipitate fight. But we no longer dared to stop or look behind us. We must have continued our headlong purgation for hours. The moon, which had given us little light at best through the heavy leafage, fell lower and lower among the enormous fronded palms and intricate creepers. But its final rays, when it sank, were all that saved us from the noisome march, which mounds and hussocks of bog-consuming grass, amid whose perilous inversions and along whose metamorphic rims we were compelled to run, without pause or hesitation or time to choose our footing, with our damnable pursuer dodging every step. Now, when the moon had gone down, our flight became wilder and more hazardous, a veritable delirium of terror, exhaustion, confusion, and desperate difficulty progressions among obstacles to which we gave no longer any distinct heed or comprehension. Through a night that clung to us and clogged us like an evil load, like the toils of a monstrous web, it would seem that the creature behind us, with its unbelievable facilities of motion and self-elongation, could have overtaken us at any time, but apparently it desired to prolong the game. And so, in a semi-eternal protraction of inclusive horrors, the night wore on, but we never dared or to stop or look back. Far off and wan, a glimmering twilight grew among the trees, a foreroaming of the hidden morn. Wearier than the dead, and longing for any repose, any security, even that of some indescribable tomb, we ran towards the light, and stumbled forth from the jungle upon a patterned street among marble and granite buildings, dimly, dully, beneath the crushing of our own fatigue. We realized that we had wandered in a circle and had come back to the suburbs of Comorium. Before us, no farther away than the toss of a javile, was the dark temple of Tasuga. Again, we ventured to look back, and we saw the elastic monster whose legs had now lengthened till it towered above us, and whose maw was wide enough to have swallowed us both at its mouthful. It followed us with an effortless glide, with a sortie of motion and intention too horrible, too cynical to be borne. We ran into the temple of Tasuga, whose door was still open just as we left it, and closing the door behind us with a fearful immensity, we contributed in the superhuman strength of our desperation to shoot one of the many rusty bolts. Now, while the chill dreariness of the dawn fell down in narrow shafts through the windows high in the wall, we tried with a truly heroic resignation to compose ourselves, and waited forever, whatever our destiny should bring. And while we waited, the god Tasuga peered upon us with an even more invincible squatness and vileness and bestiality than he had shown in Torchlight. I think I have said the lintel of the door had crumbled and splintered away in several places. In fact, the beginning process of the room had made 3 apertures, though which the daylight now filtered, and which we large enough to have permitted the passage of small animals or sizable serpents. For some reason, our eyes were drawn to these apertures. We had not gazed long when the light was suddenly intercepted in all 3 openings, and then a black material began to pour through them and ran down the door in a triple stream to the flagstones, where it reunited and resumed the form of the thing that followed us. "Farewell, Trevius Ophius," I cried, with such remaining breath as I could summon. Then I ran and concealed myself behind the image of Cuthluwu, which was large enough to screen me from view, but unfortunately was too small to serve the purpose for more than one person. Tiberius Ophi would have preceded me with the same laudable idea of self-preservation, but I was the quicker, and seeing that there was not room for both of us to be rearward of Tasuga, he returned my salutation and climbed into the great bronze basin, which alone could now afford a moment's concealment in the bareness of the fane. Peering from behind that execrable god, whose one merit was the width of his abdomen and the haunches, I observed the actions of the monster. No sooner had Trevius Ophius crouched down in the 3-legged bull, when the nameless enormity reared itself up like a sooty pillar and approached the basin. The head had now changed in form and position, that was no more than a vague imprint of the features of the middle of a body without arms, legs, or neck. That thing loomed above the brim for an instant, gathering all its bulk in an immediate mass on a sort of tapering tail, and then, like a lapping wave, it fell into the bowl upon Trevius Ophius. Its whole body seemed to open and form an immense mouth as it sank down from sight. Hardly able to breathe in my horror, I waited, but no sound and no movement came from the basin, not even a groan from Trevius Ophius. Finally, with infinite slowness and trepidation and caution, I ventured to emerge from behind Tasuga, and passing the bull on tiptoe, I managed to reach a door. Now, in order to win my freedom, it would be necessary to draw back the bolt and open the door, and I greatly feared to do so because of the inevitable noise. I felt that it would be highly injustice to disturb the entity in the bowl while it was digesting Trevius Ophius, but there seemed to be no other way, if I was ever to leave that abominable fane. Even as I shot back the bolt, a single tentacle sprang out the infernally rapidly from the basin and elongating itself across the whole room. It caught my right wrist in a lethal clutch, and it was unlike anything I had ever touched. It was indescribably viscid and slimy and cold. It was loathsomely soft like the foul mire of a bog, and moderately sharp as an edged metal, with an agonizing suction and constriction that made me scream aloud as the clutch tightened upon my flesh, cutting me like a vice of a knife of blade. In my struggle to free myself, I drew the door open and fell forward on the sill. A moment of awful pain, and then I became aware that I had broken away from my captor, but looking down, I saw that my hand was gone, leaving a strangely withered stump from which the little blood issued. Then, gazing behind me into the shrine, I saw the tentacle recoil and shorten until it passed from view behind the rim of the basin, bearing my lost hand to join whatever now remained of Trevius Ophius. What a read, honestly. I am at loss of how eldritch this is. It truly captures the sins of just gluttony, in my opinion. They greeded so much that they became dinner for an eldritch beast. Well, poor Ophius did. Our main character did get out, but he did lose an arm in the process, which was much deserved for trying to steal from a place of divine worship, be it eldritch divine, but divine nonetheless. Even with all the warnings of not going into that cursed city, they still ventured forth. The wine might have made them brave, but sure did make them dumb too. Once again, we dedicate this story to Mesotrashed, our loyal Cthulhu devotee. And until next time, bye bye.